The contract was 3 pages long. Frankie Lymon was 13 years old, sitting in a Manhattan office that smelled like cigar smoke and leather furniture, surrounded by men in expensive suits who kept smiling at him like he'd already won something. The paper sat in front of him on a mahogany desk so polished he could see his reflection in it. His reflection looked small, excited, completely unaware that signing his name in that moment would cost him everything he'd ever make for the rest of his life. One of the men had already handed him a pen, a heavy fountain pen that felt important in his small hand. "Just sign right here, kid," the man said, pointing to a line at the bottom of page 3. "Then we can get you on the radio." 300 miles away, in a small room in Chicago, Sam Cooke was 19 years old, staring at a different contract. He was reading every word, every clause, every percentage, every term. The gospel group he sang with, the Soul Stirrers, had warned him about music industry contracts. "Read everything twice," they'd told him. "Then get a lawyer to read it a third time." Sam didn't have a lawyer yet, but he had a pencil. And he was writing questions in the margins, little notes to himself. What does in perpetuity mean? Who owns the copyright after the initial term? What happens if the label goes bankrupt? Questions that would save his future. Both of them had voices that could make grown people cry. Both of them were about to become stars. But only one of them understood that talent without ownership was just permission to be exploited. This is the story of two young geniuses who walked into the same industry at almost the same time. One learned the game, the other never knew there was a game to learn. Frankie Lymon discovered his voice on the streets of Harlem in 1954. Not in a church, not in a formal music program, on a street corner at Washington Heights, where he'd harmonize with older boys who let him tag along because his voice was so pure it made their rough edges sound professional. He was 11 years old, small for his age, wearing hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit, singing doo-wop underneath the amber glow of streetlights while people walked past without stopping. Back then, nobody stopped. Nobody had to. His voice was just background music to the rhythm of Harlem life. Sam Cooke had found his voice in church. Raised in the Church of Christ Holiness in Chicago, surrounded by gospel music that shook the walls every Sunday, taught that his voice was a gift from God and therefore belonged to God's work. By the time he was a teenager, he was already being called the next great gospel singer, already being watched by people who understood what a voice like his could mean for a career. But Sam was watching too. Watching how the gospel industry worked, watching who made money and who didn't, watching how the singers poured their souls into songs while the managers counted cash in back rooms. The difference between them started early. Frankie saw music as escape. Sam saw music as business. In 1955, Frankie formed a group called the Teenagers with 4 other Harlem kids. They practiced in basements and on stoops, teaching themselves harmonies by listening to Frankie and the Teenagers' records on borrowed record players, perfecting their sound through repetition and raw talent. They had no formal training, no industry connections, no plan beyond sounding good enough that someone might notice. They were children playing at being musicians, and it showed in everything except their voices. That same year, Sam Cooke was already a professional. He joined the Soul Stirrers at 19, replacing a legendary lead singer, performing in packed churches across the South, learning stage presence, learning how to control a crowd, learning how to turn a 3-minute song into a spiritual experience that left audiences weeping. But he was also learning something else. He was learning that even in gospel music, even in God's work, there were contracts. There were percentages. There were people who made fortunes, while the singers got just enough to survive. The breakthrough came for both of them in 1956. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers recorded "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" in a small studio in New York. The song was playful, innocent, driven by Frankie's 13-year-old voice hitting notes that seemed impossible for someone so young. It exploded. Radio stations couldn't stop playing it. Teenagers across America were singing it. Frankie went from a Harlem street corner to national television in a matter of weeks. Ed Sullivan. American Bandstand. The Apollo Theater. He was everywhere suddenly. His face on magazine covers, his voice on every radio, his name in lights. The money started coming in, thousands of dollars, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Why Do Fools Fall in Love sold over 2 million copies in its first year alone. The royalties should have been life-changing. Frankie saw none of it. Not really. He got an allowance, $20 a week, maybe $50 on good weeks. The rest went to managers, producers, record label executives, men whose names Frankie barely knew, men who'd put their names on contracts Frankie had signed without reading because he was 13 and nobody had told him to read them. Nobody had told him he should ask questions. Sam Cooke watched what was happening in rock and roll, watched young black artists explode into fame and then disappear just as quickly, broke and forgotten. Watched Little Richard sell millions of records and end up with almost nothing. Watched Chuck Berry fight for every dollar he earned. Sam made a decision. If he was going to leave gospel music, if he was going to enter the secular world where the money was bigger but the exploitation was worse, he needed to understand the business first. So he started asking questions. How do publishing rights work? What does it mean to own your master recordings? What's a fair percentage? Who controls the copyright? His mentors in gospel thought he was being cynical. Just sing, they told him. God will provide. But Sam had seen too many great singers die poor. He'd watched men with voices like angels perform to packed churches and go home to apartments they couldn't afford. He'd seen the disconnect between the money coming in and the money going to the actual artists. He didn't want to be another name on that list. So he kept asking questions. He started reading music trade magazines. He attended industry meetings uninvited. He listened when the businessmen talked, learning their language, understanding their strategies. In 1957, Frankie Lymon was 15 years old and already fading. The teenagers had broken up. The hits had stopped coming. The managers who'd made millions off "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" had moved on to the next young act they could exploit. Frankie was still talented, still had that voice, but he was also growing up, and the music industry didn't know what to do with a teenage Frankie when they'd fallen in love with a 13-year-old child. He tried solo work. It didn't stick. He tried rejoining the teenagers. The chemistry was gone. He was caught between childhood and adulthood, between past success and an uncertain future, with no money saved and no one to guide him. That same year, Sam Cooke left gospel music and crossed over to secular pop with "You Send Me." The song went to #1. Sam was suddenly a star. But unlike Frankie, Sam had prepared. He'd negotiated his contract carefully. He'd brought in lawyers. He'd asked for a higher percentage of royalties than most new artists got. He didn't get everything he wanted, but he got more than most because he'd asked. Because he'd understood that negotiation was part of the job. But Sam knew even that wasn't enough. He watched how other artists got trapped by their labels, locked into contracts that gave them fame, but no control, no ownership, no power. He decided he needed to go further. In 1961, Sam Cooke did something almost unheard of for a black artist at that time. He started his own record label, SAR Records. Sam and his business partner owned it completely. They signed other artists. They produced records. They controlled the entire process from recording to distribution. Sam was 29 years old and building an empire. Frankie Lymon was 19, living in a small apartment in Harlem, struggling with bills he couldn't pay from royalties he'd never actually received. The money from Why Do Fools Fall in Love should have set him up for life. The song was still playing on oldies stations, still being covered by other artists, still making money. Just not for Frankie. He'd signed away his publishing rights, signed away his royalties, signed away his future, and because he'd signed those contracts as a minor, with no legal representation, with no adult actually looking out for his interests, the courts later ruled that he had no claim to the money. The people who'd managed him as a child had protected themselves legally. They hadn't protected him. What nobody knew was that Frankie had started using heroin, not recreationally, not as an experiment, as an escape from the realization that he'd been used and discarded, that his childhood had been stolen, that his talent had been exploited, that the fame he'd achieved had left him with nothing but memories and debts. He'd wake up some mornings and wonder if any of it had been real. The screaming crowds, the television appearances, the magazine covers with his face. It had all happened so fast and disappeared even faster. The drugs made it easier to not think about how he'd gone from selling out theaters to barely affording rent, made it easier to not think about the men who'd patted him on the head and told him to trust them while they signed their names on contracts that made them rich and left him broke. Sam Cooke understood something that Frankie never got the chance to learn. Talent gets you in the door. Ownership keeps you in the house. Sam didn't just perform. He studied the business. He attended meetings with lawyers and accountants. He learned about copyright law, publishing rights, mechanical royalties, performance royalties. He learned which questions to ask and which answers to trust. He learned that in the music industry, ignorance wasn't innocence, it was vulnerability. By 1963, Sam Cooke was one of the most powerful black artists in America. Not just successful, powerful. He owned his masters. He controlled his publishing. He decided which songs to record and which to reject. When he wrote A Change Is Gonna Come, a song about the civil rights struggle, about dignity and justice and the long fight for equality, he released it on his terms. Nobody could tell him the song was too political. Nobody could block it. He owned the rights to his own voice, his own message, his own legacy. Frankie Lymon was 21 and living between Harlem and wherever he could find someone to let him stay for free. He'd tried multiple comebacks. They'd all failed. Not because his voice was gone, but because the industry had moved on, and because he had no leverage, no ownership, nothing to fall back on. When Why Do Fools Fall in Love played on the radio, he'd sometimes hear it in diners or record stores, and people around him had no idea that the voice they were hearing belonged to the broke young man standing next to them. He'd become a ghost, haunting his own success. The tragedy deepened. Sam Cooke was shot and killed on December 11, 1964, at the Hacienda Motel in Los Angeles. The circumstances were murky, disputed, suspicious. He was 33 years old. The investigation was quick, the conclusions questionable. But even in death, Sam's legacy was protected by the one thing Frankie never had: ownership. Sam's estate retained control of his music. His family received royalties. His catalog continued to generate income because Sam had structured his business to outlive him. He'd planned for a future he didn't get to see, and that planning saved his legacy. Frankie lived 4 more years. 4 years of poverty and addiction and failed attempts to reclaim what had been taken from him. Multiple record labels tried to revive his career, but each attempt felt more desperate than the last. He was singing the same songs from his childhood, while growing older in a body that still carried the voice of a 13-year-old boy. The disconnect was painful to watch. By 1968, Frankie Lymon was 25 years old and looked 40. The heroin had aged him. The disappointment had hollowed him out. The realization that he'd been robbed of his childhood, his money, and his future had left him with nothing to build on. On February 27, 1968, Frankie Lymon was found dead in his grandmother's apartment in Harlem. Heroin overdose. He was 25 years old. He died broke. No savings, no assets, no ownership of the music he'd created. When Why Do Fools Fall in Love played on the radio the next day, the royalties went to Morris Levy and George Goldner, the men who'd signed a 13-year-old to a contract that gave them everything and gave him almost nothing. The legal battles started immediately. 3 different women claimed to be Frankie's widow, each fighting for rights to his estate, except there was no estate. There was no money. There was only the question of who owned the song that had made millions for everyone except the boy who'd sung it. The lawsuits lasted for decades. Courts tried to determine percentages and ownership stakes and legal marriages. All of it happened without Frankie. He was just the ghost at the center of a legal war over money he'd never seen. Sam Cooke's family received royalties. Frankie Lymon's family received lawyers. The difference between them wasn't talent. Both were geniuses. Both had voices that defined their era. Both were young black men entering an industry designed to exploit them. The difference was knowledge. Sam knew what questions to ask. Frankie didn't know there were questions to ask. Sam had mentors who taught him to read contracts and hire lawyers and demand ownership. Frankie had managers who taught him to smile for cameras and show up on time and trust the adults in the room. Sam understood that the music industry was a business, and businesses had rules, and knowing the rules meant you could negotiate. Frankie understood that music was art, and art was about feeling, and feeling meant trusting people who said they'd take care of everything. Both perspectives had truth, but only one led to survival. Today, Sam Cooke is remembered as a soul legend, a business pioneer, a civil rights voice, an artist who changed the industry by demanding respect and ownership. His songs still generate millions. His influence is taught in music schools. His business model is studied by artists trying to avoid the traps he escaped. His name is spoken with reverence by everyone from Beyoncé to Kendrick Lamar, artists who understand that his fight for ownership paved the way for their own independence. Frankie Lymon is remembered, when he's remembered at all, as a cautionary tale. The child star who had everything and lost it all. The talented kid who trusted the wrong people. The voice that should have made him a fortune but left him with nothing. His story is told in documentaries about exploitation, in books about the dark side of the music industry, in warnings given to young artists about what happens when you don't read the contract. Every time a new teenage sensation appears, industry veterans whisper his name as a reminder of what can go wrong. Both of them deserved better than they got. Sam fought for better and won some of those fights before his life was cut short. Frankie never knew he was supposed to fight. He thought showing up and singing was enough. He thought the men in suits who smiled at him had his best interests at heart. He thought being talented meant being protected. He was 13 years old when he signed that contract in the office that smelled like cigar smoke and leather. The men around him were experienced, connected, legally protected. He was a child. He never stood a chance, not because he wasn't talented enough, because the game was rigged and nobody had told him he was playing a game at all. Sam Cooke learned the game and changed it. Frankie Lymon played the game without knowing the rules and lost everything. That's the difference between knowledge and exploitation, between power and vulnerability, between a legacy that lasts and a tragedy that gets repeated every time another young artist signs their name without understanding what they're signing away. Two young geniuses, two extraordinary voices. One learned that talent without ownership is just another form of slavery. The other learned it too late, if he ever learned it at all. And the music industry kept spinning, kept profiting, kept finding new young voices to exploit, because the lesson that should have been learned from Frankie Lymon's death is still being ignored today. They both had the voice. Only one had the plan. And in the end, that made all the difference.